Back in September 2021, I sold my MG ZS EV. Used values were very strong. With the impending need for a sizable house deposit, I thought it was best to move it on. I was wrong, of course, because values continued to rise and I could have sold it for even more just a month or two later. My ownership experience with the ZS was positive on the whole, and I would definitely consider another MG EV in the future. After a brief encounter with this Audi e-tron 55 from Onto, I sadly had to say goodbye to that as well. I absolutely adored the e-tron, but with a monthly rental of £1,300 per month, I wasn't particularly comfortable that that was compatible with the whole saving money to buy a house thing. So it had to go. And it was time to buy something cheap and cheerful. Now this was harder in late 2021 than you might think, with the prices of absolutely everything at an all-time high, no matter what was under the bonnet. Enter then my 2005 Audi A8 with a 3-litre V6 diesel engine. Perhaps not the first thing you imagine when thinking about cheap, sensible motoring, but it was cheap and it was in working order, so some would say the perfect stopgap. With over 200,000 miles on the clock, it had made it this far, so it'll do a bit longer, won't it? Although fairly dependable, costing surprisingly little to repair and just over 10,000 miles of pretty hard commuting miles, it was becoming a little bit of a pain. Clean air zones and ULEZ meant more and more journeys were out of the question, given it was a Euro 4 diesel. And despite being the size of a small country, it's not actually that practical. Like most saloons, it's good at moving people around, but not really good at much else. It's time for a change, and that change couldn't really be anything other than something electric, could it? This then is my 2021 Renault Zoe GT line. I think some of you probably saw that coming. After I made the video about the used market for the Zoe, I'm actually quite surprised by the bargains that were out there. Well, I went to my nearest Renault dealer and I did a bit of shopping. It might not surprise you to learn that this particular car is ex-Onto. I think the vast majority of Zoes of this age that are for sale in the UK at the moment will have belonged to Onto, who had, I think it was around 1,000 of them at one point on their fleet of this age. So they had both the GT line and the Iconic on their fleet at some point in their 2021 cars, and they've all been defleeted and replaced now. And so it'd be no surprise to hear that a bargainous Zoe that's nearly new and hasn't done that many miles has been on a rental fleet. Now, that doesn't really bother me. I know some people get a little bit uptight about ex-rentals, but at the end of the day, with Onto, you have like a £1,000 excess or a £1,500 excess. I can't remember. I mean, I had a car from Onto and I can't remember, but it was a steep anyway, and that definitely sharpens the mind if you're renting one of these cars and it's got a big excess. It certainly makes you be quite careful with it. And I mean, it's got just over 11,500 miles on the clock, so it wasn't even really used that much, let's be honest. I estimate that it was on their fleet for about 15 months roughly, because it went into the trade in March this year, so it's been lingering around in the trade for that length of time. I'm guessing because there were so many of these coming off hire at the same time that bunches of them have been sat around for a while. But all in all, I think you'd be hard pushed to tell this apart from a brand new Zoe. There's very, very little sign of wear anywhere. There's a couple of tiny little scratches on the gear selector here where I think somebody's maybe had quite long nails, a previous user of the car. This is a couple of little scratches, but apart from that, it really is in really good condition, as you'd expect any nearly new car to be, no matter where it's been. Now, how do I know it's ex-Onto? Well, I'd love to tell you stories about how, I've got insider knowledge and I've analysed this and I've looked at that, but the dealership left the sticker on the window. So the Onto sticker is still here with both their phone number, the QR code, and then all the things telling you what not to do, like no smoking, all that stuff. It's still here. Pretty poor prep from a Renault main dealer, but I kind of get why they didn't spot it, because it's this like translucent sticker. But yeah, it's pretty poor. But That's how I know it's X-On2, but as I say, it doesn't really bother me. So already I think the overwhelming reaction from you in the comments is probably going to be, have you actually taken leave of your senses? Or do you think that a little French Super Mini is a fair replacement for a big luxury barge? And yeah, totally fair comment, absolutely. But I think the thing is with the A8 is actually, I was guilty of doing what I've talked about when I talk about AMI quite a lot, which is buying a vehicle that makes sense for one particular use case, and for me that is my long commute. The office is 110 miles away from home. It's one of those commutes that a lot of people will tell me they definitely have and they absolutely must use a diesel car for, because they couldn't possibly cope with it. But the thing is, I'm fortunate enough to have charging in the office. I've got to pay for it these days. It was free when I started working there, but now it is paid for, but it's not the end of the world. And so what I found was the Audi is very, very good at the commute. It's absolutely at home on the motorway. It's what it's built for. It's absolutely brilliant at it. But that's about it. It's really not very good at much else. You know, if you take it to like a multi-storey car park, something like that, because it's so long and it's quite wide, and it's just a bit of a pain. And don't get me wrong, the Zoe is probably at the other end of the spectrum. It's quite a small car. I would have preferred something a little bit bigger. But I think if we think about to maintain something of the same sort of quality as the A8, we would have been looking at like the Audi e-tron 55, which obviously I did have for a couple of months from on to back at the end of 2021, that I'm quite familiar with, and that is what I would have bought if I was looking for something with the same sort of ability as the A8 in terms of comfort and refinement, because it really was very good with its air suspension and all that stuff. But even now, with used prices heading the way they are, you are going to be looking at least sort of £30,000 for an e-tron 55. You can maybe find one a little bit cheaper. The 50 I wouldn't entertain because of the battery size wouldn't really be, it's more of a hindrance than anything. So the 55 would be the one, and 30 grand is the kind of asking price. Well, as you know, this was almost a third of that, right? So this was £13,000, and therefore significantly cheaper. And on the finance deals that were being offered as well by Renault, who are obviously quite keen to shift these, you know, they're stuck with like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these X-On2 Zoes, and they're obviously putting some support behind that in the form of cheap finance. So it makes it significantly cheaper, to the point where I couldn't really find anything else that came close in terms of the sort of the financial side of things. So whilst we're going down a little bit in size and comfort, it's really quite cheap. So that obviously was a big deciding factor. But you also need to look at what you are actually getting for the money. So you have a 52 kilowatt hour battery, you have a real world summer range of over 200 miles. And even in the winter, most of you commenting on my last video about the Zoe were saying you have a ZE50, and 170 miles is perfectly achievable in winter, and then that, for me, that's absolutely perfect. It means that I can do my commute no matter what the weather is. I don't need to worry. I'm not going to be thinking, oh, and maybe better turn the heater off or anything like that, which with a slightly smaller battery, when I did it with the MG ZS EV, with its both sort of lesser efficiency and also smaller battery, you started to think a little bit, because although it could do it, you were running quite low on range by the time I got to my destination. You're not going to have that problem with this. But you also have the vast majority of the creature comforts that you want. You've got, you know, air conditioning, automatic climate control, you've got a sat-nav, all that stuff, you know, the things you expect from most modern cars now. It doesn't scrimp on the spec just because it's a sort of small, cheap car. One thing that is missing is heated seats and the heated steering wheel, which on this were an optional extra. Onto obviously didn't want to spring for that. Can't really blame them with the number of cars they were buying. So that's not present. You either needed to spec the winter pack or go for the GT line plus to get those, and that's about the only notable omission. Might be a bit of a pain in the winter, but at the end of the day, I'm sure I'll live without that. And what you get is a fairly well-appointed cabin. We got these sort of half pleather seats, which are actually quite nice. What I like about these, I actually like the fabric bit. It's got that sort of recycled material vibe going on, like the i3 does, and I think it's quite nice. It feels like it'll be really hard wearing and stuff too. And I'm really pleased with the paint as well. This metallic red, I think, looks really, really good. I had a choice of colours, so they were available in black, grey, that blue that all the press cars were in, or this red, and I think the red looks really, really good. So I think that was the right choice. But I also get why somebody might want something a little bit more understated. It certainly pops, but I do like it. And although this is, you know, getting on a bit now, the Zoe, because let's be honest, it's not that much different to the original 22 kilowatt hour car that was first released in 2012. But I do think it still feels pretty modern in here. I think the fact it's had enough of an update. You know, we've got a very modern looking digital instrument cluster, and this new sat-nav screen and stuff we have in the ZE50. I think it all looks really quite modern and really quite good. So definitely happy with that. And what this does mean as well is I'll be able to go straight back to looking at, so, you know, public charging reviews and looking at new sites that are opening and all that kind of stuff, because there'll be much more need for me to public charge when I've got an EV as my one and only sort of daily driver. We're completely internal combustion engine free now. I mean, I do still have that old Fiat Panda 30, but that doesn't really count because it's not on the road because it doesn't work. But in terms of internal combustion for transport, actual viable transport, that's it, totally gone. We're all electric now. So we got the i3, Zoe, Ami, and Kangoo. Now, I think something's going to have to give there. There's going to be a change in the fleet shortly. So one of them's going to have to go. We'll see which one that is. It's probably going to be Kangoo, let's be honest. I don't think we're quite finished with Ami yet. I think there's a lot to do still in terms of making videos with Ami. So I think nobody seems to really care much about the Kangoo either. So I think Kangoo's high on the list for vehicles that will be leaving, but we'll see how it goes. I'll see Ami. I don't know if any of you noticed, but I was on BBC Radio 4 the other day talking about Ami. So there's a link in the description. Do check that out if you're interested. There was a feature on there about electric cars and about the Citroen Ami, and I was on there, which was quite interesting. It's the first time I've ever been on like radio or anything like that. So yeah, it's quite cool. I'll also undoubtedly be making some longer journeys. So previously, if we ever had to like go to Scotland or whatever, then the Audi was the car for that job. That's not going to be the case anymore, and it's going to be up to this. So it'll be really interesting to see how that compares versus the MG ZS, which previously filled that role. That'll be really, really interesting. I mean, it's definitely not going to compare to the e-tron 55 with its crazy fast charging, but it should give the MG a good run for its money, I suspect. I think when I was working it out, you knock one, maybe two charging stops off versus the MG. So although the Zoe does charge a little bit slower, I think less stops is always a good thing. So it will be quite interesting. There will be a trip at some point, I'm not sure when, but it will be interesting to see how it holds up. But we're definitely going all in with the sort of all electric thing. So I'm even finally getting a proper home charger. I posted a couple of polls and stuff about home chargers, so I've opted for an untethered Zappi, and that is getting installed in a couple of weeks' time. I thought there was definitely time to finally, now that I'm in a house that I own that has off-street parking, we can have a proper home charger. I don't need to either slum it with a granny lead, or I used to in the last house I owned, I had a commando socket, used a commando Omi, but we're going to do it properly this time, and Zappi was the charger of choice, so that should be getting installed shortly. I'm definitely looking forward to that. I've used Octopus for the charger install. They seem to be really good value at the moment for home chargers. I mean, it's still £1,000, don't get me wrong. We're way beyond the point where EV home chargers were cheap things to get installed, obviously with the demise of the government grant and stuff. I thought when the grant went away, prices would start coming down because people were kind of milking the grant, but now we seem to have fixed the pricing at about £1,000. Even the quote I had from My Energy themselves to install the Zappies, My Energy being the manufacturer of the Zappi. Now I'm assuming they just subbed this out to someone, but it was £1,400 including VAT to supply and install an untethered Zappi. And Octopus are doing it for $999. So although it's still a lot of money, I thought it seems about the best value I could find at the moment. So if you can call £1,000 for a glorified connector box on the wall, a good value, but that's the world we live in, and the convenience of having a home charger completely trumps any sort of sense of it. I've heard people say this, like, you talk about home charging, like, oh, when will that pay for itself with your cheaper energy versus public charging? That just doesn't come into the equation for me. I'm not interested in what the payback period is on a home charger. The convenience of being able to plug in and charge in a reasonable amount of time is way beyond. And the charger that's right next to my house that I used to use for free is now 60 pence per kilowatt hour anyway, so home charging is definitely much cheaper. I'm going to stick with Octopus Agile for now. but I will do wonder if charging sort of 2.5 EVs is going to be a bit interesting in terms of getting enough cheap or cheaper power. I might end up having to move on to another tariff, but Octopus Agile does look okay at the moment. I think if as long as you're selective about when you charge, it's not too bad. And Zappi does support Agile. Bit of debate over whether Zappi actually lets you specify, like, oh, don't charge above a certain price, but it seems that if you use the web interface rather than the app, it lets you do that. So I'm hoping My Energy fix that so that the app does it all soon, but that's, at least it does support it. That was quite important for me, that it would support Agile. But that's it for this video. It was just a brief unveiling of my new Renault Zoe. I will do some more sort of closer look type stuff with this if you're interested, if you want to, you know, see a bit more of the ins and outs, but I need a little bit more time just to get used to it, and then we can take a closer look. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know what you think in the comments. I'm sure some of you do think I'm clinically insane, and that's perfectly fine. I'll see you next time.